My name is Tessa Myers, and I'm 31 years old. 2 years ago, my father disowned me by text message, exactly 14 hours before I walked down the aisle. His reason was simple. I refused to cut my college roommates from my wedding guest list to make room for 4 of his real estate investors. He told me I was dead to him. For 2 years, my phone never rang. Then last month, my father finally reached out. He did not call to apologize. He called because my mother was supposedly dying of heart failure, and he needed my legal signature on a document to save her life. When I found out the truth, I sent him a 4-word text message that dismantled his entire retirement plan. Before I explain exactly what those 4 words were, please take a second to like and subscribe. Welcome to Sweet Karma Life. Drop your age, your city, and your local time in the comments below. I love seeing the diversity of this community. Now, let me take you back to a rainy Friday night in Chicago and the phone call that started the unraveling. I was sitting at my kitchen island with a yellow highlighter. I work as a commercial lease auditor in the downtown district. My daily job is hunting down hidden liabilities. I read the buried clauses that corporate developers use to extract money from unsuspecting tenants. I trace escrow accounts. I verify contractor invoices. I track numbers for a living. I know when the math makes rigid sense, and I know when someone is hiding their true intentions behind paperwork. That specific skill set is important for what happens next. Outside, rain was beating against the glass. My husband David was rinsing coffee mugs in the sink. The apartment was quiet. Then my cell phone vibrated against the quartz countertop. The screen lit up with a name I had not seen in 24 months. Chloe, my younger sister. David turned off the faucet. He dried his hands on a towel and stared at the glowing screen. He knew exactly what that name meant. The last time my family tried to contact me, I was sitting in the lobby of the Palmer House Hotel in my rehearsal dinner dress. It was the night before our wedding. My father, Richard, had marched up to me holding a printed seating chart. He dropped it on my lap. He had taken a black marker and crossed out the names of my 4 best friends. In the margins, he had written the names of his new business partners. I told him the venue was at fire capacity and the catering was finalized. I told him he could not hijack my wedding to impress his investors. Richard did not yell. He never yells. He just adjusted his tie, looked at me with sheer disgust, and walked out the revolving doors. At 2 a.m, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. His message was brief. If my partners are not welcome, my money is not either. Pay for it yourself. He pulled all the funding the morning of the wedding. He boycotted the ceremony. My mother, Susan, and my sister Chloe stayed home in solidarity. David and I did not panic. We sat on the edge of the hotel bed, opened our laptops, and drained our joint savings account. We wired the final balances to the florist, the venue coordinator, and the caterer before the sun even came up. We stood at the altar and said our vows. We danced with our friends. After the honeymoon, we bought a modest house. We built a steady, quiet life, insulated from the Myers family dynamic. I mourned the loss of my parents, but I learned to enjoy the silence. Now, 2 years later, Chloe was calling. I let it ring 3 times. I pressed the green button and put it on speakerphone so David could hear. Chloe did not say hello. She was hyperventilating. Her voice was frantic and shrill.
Tessa, you have to come home. Mom collapsed. We are at St. Jude Hospital. The doctor said her arteries are blocked. They are taking her into surgery right now for an emergency quadruple bypass.
My stomach dropped. The air left my lungs. My mother was 56 years old. She ran local charity races. A quadruple bypass meant surgeons cracking her sternum. It meant a ventilator and a high risk of stroke. Chloe was crying so hard she was choking on her words.
Dad is falling apart. You need to come here tonight. He says we need you. Please.
The line went dead. David went straight to the hall closet and pulled down my black overnight bag. He did not ask questions. He grabbed his car keys. I shook my head. I told him to stay. If I was walking into an intensive care waiting room with my estranged father, I needed to handle the tension alone. I promised to call him as soon as I saw a doctor. I threw a few shirts into the bag, grabbed my coat, and ran out to my car. The drive to my parents' suburban neighborhood usually takes 40 minutes. I drove through the pouring rain, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The highway streetlights flashed in the dark. The entire way, my mind raced through the terrifying medical logistics. I tried to remember my mother's blood type. I wondered if they had a living will on file. I braced myself for the sterile smell of the hospital corridors. I pictured my mother unconscious, surrounded by tubes and machines. But 30 minutes into the drive, Chloe sent a follow-up text message. She did not send me the address to St. Jude Hospital. She sent me the address to my parents' house. I parked in their driveway. The front porch light was on. There were no ambulances. There was no rush. I walked up the front steps, turned the brass handle, and pushed the door open. Nobody was crying. I stepped out of the rain and into the foyer of my childhood home. Water dripped from my coat onto the hardwood floor. I expected chaos. I expected my sister pacing the hallway or my father frantically packing an overnight bag for the hospital. Instead, the house was dead silent. The air smelled of roasted chicken and thyme. In the living room, the television was tuned to a muted golf tournament. I walked past the kitchen. The counter was clean. There were no discarded coffee cups. There were no hasty notes scribbled on a notepad by the telephone. I turned the corner into the den and stopped. My father, Richard, was sitting in his burgundy leather recliner. He wore a tailored beige sweater and dark slacks. A glass of amber bourbon rested in his hand. The ice cubes clinked gently against the crystal as he swirled the liquid. He did not look like a man whose wife was currently having her chest sawed open by cardiothoracic surgeons. He looked like a man unwinding after a successful day at the office. I asked him where my mother was. I asked why we were not at the intensive care unit. Richard did not jump up. He did not rush over to hug his estranged daughter. He simply gestured to the leather sofa opposite his chair. He told me to sit down. He spoke in a measured, practiced tone. It was the exact voice he used when pitching commercial real estate developments to skeptical zoning boards. He set his glass on the wooden coaster. He folded his hands together and sighed heavily. He told me my mother had suffered a severe cardiac event that afternoon. He claimed the local emergency room doctors panicked. They realized her blockages were too complex for their surgical team. According to Richard, they loaded her into an ambulance and transferred her to a private, specialized cardiac facility 40 miles away. Then he delivered the pivot. He said the private hospital was entirely out of network. Richard looked down at his shoes, playing the part of a defeated patriarch. He explained that his health insurance provider flatly denied the emergency authorization. They categorized the transfer as elective rather than life-saving. He said the billing department at this new facility ran the numbers. The required bypass surgery would cost $85,000. I sat frozen on the sofa. I listened to his words, but my professional instincts were already rejecting the narrative. I audit complex financial contracts for a living. I understand institutional liability. A hospital cannot deny emergency, life-saving heart surgery based on network status. Federal law prohibits dumping critical patients over insurance disputes. Furthermore, billing departments do not calculate exact surgical costs while a patient is actively dying in triage. But Richard kept talking, spinning the web tighter. He claimed the hospital administration refused to wheel my mother into the operating room without a massive financial guarantee. He said they were demanding the $85,000 up front. If he could not produce the payment by Monday morning, they were threatening to place an immediate, aggressive lien on his residential property. None of the math worked. A hospital does not execute a property lien over the weekend. They bill you. They send statements. They offer payment plans. They do not hold dying wives hostage for cash. Before I could question the timeline, Richard shifted his strategy. He moved from logistics to emotional manipulation. He leaned forward and stared right at me. He said I walked away from them 2 years ago. He reminded me that I chose my friends over my family on my wedding day. He said my mother had cried every night since I vanished from their lives. He lowered his voice, making it sound thick with fabricated grief. He told me I had abandoned them, but now I had a chance to make things right. He said the very least I could do was help save my mother's life. He reached down to the floor. He picked up his leather briefcase and clicked the brass locks open. He did not pull out a hospital invoice. He did not produce a transfer order or a medical chart. He pulled out a thick stack of legal paper bound by a blue paper clip. He slid the document across the glass coffee table toward me. I leaned forward and read the bold text at the top of the first page. It was a formal authorization to dissolve a joint inheritance trust. The trust belonged to my late grandfather. My grandfather was a union pipe fitter who worked 60-hour weeks and never bought a luxury car in his life. He saw how Richard leveraged debt to fund a flashy lifestyle. When my grandfather passed away, he bypassed his son entirely. He locked $170,000 into a restrictive trust account designed specifically for Chloe and me. The rules were ironclad. The money could not be touched, transferred, or liquidated unless both sisters provided a notarized signature of consent in the presence of the trust administrator. Richard tapped his index finger against the signature line on the final page. He told me Chloe had already signed her half away. He said she did it without hesitation because she loved her mother. He explained that if I signed the paper tonight, the trust administrator could liquidate the account first thing on Monday morning. Richard would take the $85,000 to pay the hospital, save his house from the lien, and keep my mother alive. He pulled a silver pen from his shirt pocket and held it out to me. He promised he would pay me back every single dime with interest as soon as his next property development closed. I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the trust dissolution form. I looked at the glass of bourbon sweating on the coaster. The air in the room felt heavy. My mind raced through the discrepancies. The smell of roasted chicken, the relaxed posture, the lack of medical paperwork, the sudden demand to liquidate a specific account my father had coveted for years. I did not yell. I did not accuse him of lying. I kept my face entirely blank. I stood up from the leather sofa and buttoned my wet coat. I told him I would sign the document. Richard's shoulders visibly dropped. A flicker of triumph flashed across his face. He pushed the paper closer to the edge of the table and held the pen higher. But I kept my hands in my pockets. I looked down at him and spoke in a steady, quiet voice. I said I would sign the document, but only after I drove to the private cardiac facility. I said I needed to see my mother breathing. I needed to speak to the chief surgeon, and I needed to review the billing statements directly with the hospital administrator. The living room felt dead silent. The television flickered in the background. Richard froze. His hand hovered over the table. He did not immediately offer the name of the hospital. He did not jump up to grab his car keys to lead the way. He just sat there, staring at me, and he hesitated for just a second too long. That single second of silence was all the proof I needed. I turned my back to him and walked out the front door. I left my father's house and sat in my car for a full minute. The rain hammered against the windshield. Richard had claimed my mother was transferred to a specialty clinic 40 miles away. But liars often build their fabrications around a kernel of truth. Chloe had panicked on the phone. Her initial terrors sounded real. She had named St. Jude Hospital. People in a state of sudden shock default to facts before they have time to invent the fiction. I put the car in drive and headed straight towards St. Jude. It was only 3 miles down the road. The hospital parking garage was quiet at this hour. I parked on the second level and walked toward the main entrance. The sliding glass doors parted, welcoming me into a brightly lit lobby. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. There was no frantic energy. A lone security guard sat near the elevators, reading a paperback novel. I approached the front desk. An older woman in a pink volunteer jacket looked up from her computer monitor. I asked for the room number of Susan Myers. I braced myself for her to check the intensive care registry. I waited for the sympathetic head tilt that hospital workers give to grieving family members. The woman typed the last name into her keyboard. She did not express pity. She simply printed a visitor pass and handed it across the counter. "Room 412, she said. "Take the B elevator to the 4th floor. Take a left at the nurse's station." I looked at the printed pass. The 4th floor at St. Jude was not the cardiac intensive care unit. I knew the layout of this hospital because my grandfather spent his final days here. The 4th floor was general surgical recovery. It was where they sent patients who had their tonsils out or their knees replaced. I pinned the pass to my lapel and stepped into the elevator. My pulse remained steady. The anxiety that had gripped me on the highway was gone. In its place, a cold, calculating clarity settled over my mind. I was no longer a terrified daughter. I was an auditor stepping onto a site inspection. The elevator doors opened. I stepped onto the linoleum. A true cardiac recovery wing is a fortress. It requires scrub stations, restricted access doors, and a hushed environment. Patients who just had their rib cages cracked open are surrounded by specialized machinery. You hear the rhythmic pumping of ventilators. You see crash carts positioned in the hallways. The 4th floor had none of those things. A nurse walked past me carrying a tray of ginger ale. A television blared a late-night talk show from an open doorway. I followed the room numbers painted on the wall, 410, 411. I stopped outside the door to room 412. The door was propped wide open. I stepped into the threshold and looked at the hospital bed. My mother was sitting upright. She was wearing a light blue hospital gown, but her color was excellent. Her skin was flushed and healthy. She was not hooked up to a ventilator. There were no heavy cardiac monitors tracking her heart rhythms. She had a standard saline drip hooked into her left hand. Susan Myers, the woman who supposedly needed an $85,000 emergency quadruple bypass to survive the night, was holding half of a turkey sandwich. She was watching a reality television show and chewing. I stood in the doorway, letting the scene register. I looked at her chest. A sternotomy requires a massive vertical incision down the center of the chest. It requires heavy bandaging and drainage tubes. The neckline of her gown hung loosely, revealing smooth, unblemished skin. Before I could say a word, a nurse walked into the room holding a digital tablet. She smiled at me, assuming I was just another late-night visitor. She approached the bed and wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my mother's arm. My mother finally noticed me. She dropped the sandwich onto her tray table. Her eyes went wide. She let out a weak theatrical gasp and slumped back against the pillows, clutching her chest with her free hand. She closed her eyes, playing the part of a fragile invalid. The nurse checked the tablet and noted the blood pressure reading. I stepped further into the room. I kept my voice polite and professional. I asked the nurse how the bypass surgery went. I mentioned that I was worried about the sternum healing process and the potential for arterial blockages. The nurse stopped adjusting the blood pressure cuff. Her polite smile vanished, replaced by a wall of strict professionalism. She looked at me, her tone firm. "I am sorry, but under HIPAA regulations, I cannot discuss a patient's medical history with visitors without explicit verbal authorization," she said. Then, the nurse turned her full attention to my mother, her brow furrowed with genuine, urgent medical concern. "Mrs. Myers, are you experiencing chest pain?" the nurse asked loudly. "Because if you believe you have had a cardiac bypass, I need to call the rapid response team immediately. You are only admitted under Dr. Evans for a routine laparoscopic gallbladder removal. Did someone give you the wrong paperwork, or are you having a medical emergency?" Routine, laparoscopic, gallbladder. The words hung in the sterile air. My mother squeezed her eyes shut tightly, refusing to look at me. She kept her hand pressed over her heart, a gesture that now looked entirely ridiculous. The math aligned. The puzzle pieces snapped into place. A gallbladder removal is a standard procedure. Health insurance covers it seamlessly. It requires a tiny incision, an overnight stay, and a few $100s in out-of-pocket copays. It does not require liquidating a $170,000 trust fund. Before I could question my mother, the heavy wooden doors swung open. My younger sister Chloe rushed into the room. She was wearing a designer trench coat and carrying a leather tote bag. She did not look like someone standing vigil at a deathbed. She looked like she just came from a business dinner. Chloe had her cell phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking loudly, her tone sharp and commanding. "I do not care what the vendor said," Chloe barked into the phone. "The track lighting needs to be installed by Wednesday. The espresso machine delivery date was guaranteed for Thursday morning. We are opening the doors on Saturday. If the hardware is not mounted, I will pull the contract." Chloe turned her head and saw me standing at the foot of the bed. She froze. The color drained from her face. She lowered the phone from her ear and quickly pressed the end call button. She shoved the device deep into her trench coat pocket. In a fraction of a second, her demeanor shifted. The demanding business owner vanished. The helpless younger sister appeared. Her lower lip began to tremble. Tears welled up in her eyes on command. She rushed to the side of the hospital bed and grabbed my mother's hand. "Oh, Tessa," Chloe sobbed, her voice echoing off the tile walls. "Thank God you made it. It has been a nightmare. Her heart is just so weak. We almost lost her today." "We are so scared." She buried her face in the hospital blankets. My mother stroked Chloe's hair, maintaining her silent, pained expression. They were putting on a master class in emotional manipulation. I stood there and watched the performance. Years ago, this scene would have broken me. I would have handed over my savings. I would have signed the paperwork just to make my sister stop crying. Chloe had always been the golden child. Growing up, my parents funded her every whim. They paid for her luxury cars, her abandoned college degrees, and her failed startup ideas, while I worked night shifts to pay my own tuition. Now, she was talking about track lighting and espresso machines while our mother faked a cardiac event. My auditor instincts screamed the answer. The $85,000 was not for a hospital lien. It was seed money. It was capital for whatever business venture Chloe was launching on Saturday. I did not confront them. A confrontation gives the opposition time to build a defense. I needed hard documentation. I needed the exact numbers. I smiled warmly at my sister. I told her I was so relieved our mother was resting comfortably. I kept my voice soothing and compliant. I said I was going to head down to the cafeteria to grab a cup of black coffee. I promised I would be right back to discuss the financial paperwork Dad had shown me. Chloe sniffled and nodded, looking incredibly relieved that I had taken the bait. I turned and walked out of the hospital room. I did not go to the cafeteria. I walked straight to the elevators and hit the button for the ground floor. I was heading to the hospital billing department. It was time to pull the receipts. I walked out of the hospital room and let the heavy wooden door click shut behind me. I did not take the elevator down to the cafeteria. I bypassed the lobby, pushed through the sliding glass doors, and walked straight out into the damp night air. The rain had reduced to a steady drizzle. I crossed the asphalt of the parking garage, unlocked my car, and slid into the driver's seat. I locked the doors immediately. The silence inside the cabin was a sharp contrast to the theatrical performance echoing on the 4th floor. I reached into my overnight bag on the passenger seat and pulled out my laptop. I flipped the screen open and connected the device to my cellular hotspot. My hands were not shaking. The initial panic that had gripped my chest on the highway was entirely gone. In its place, a cold and methodical focus took over. If my family wanted to play a game of numbers, they had chosen the wrong opponent. Years ago, before the wedding disaster severed our relationship, I acted as the unofficial accountant for the Myers household. My parents were financially literate but technologically inept. When they transitioned to paperless billing, I was the one who set up their online portals. I created their usernames, I established their security questions. Because they constantly forgot their passwords, I kept a secure encrypted spreadsheet on my own hard drive with all their login credentials. They never bothered to change them. Arrogance often breeds digital laziness. I opened a web browser and navigated to the Blue Cross Insurance portal. I typed in my mother's email address and the old password. The screen loaded instantly. I clicked on the Claims tab. The dashboard displayed a chronological list of recent medical billing. At the very top, marked as pending, was an entry from St. Jude Hospital dated yesterday afternoon. I downloaded the detailed explanation of benefits and opened the PDF. The document was transparent. The procedure code listed was for a laparoscopic cholecystectomy, a standard gallbladder removal. The hospital billed the insurance provider $12,000. The negotiated network rate brought the total down significantly. I scrolled to the bottom line, the section labeled Patient Responsibility. The final amount my parents owed out of pocket was exactly $450. I stared at the number on the glowing screen. $450. That was the true cost of my mother's medical event. So where did Richard get the figure of $85,000? Fraudsters rarely invent arbitrary numbers when they are desperate for capital. A random number like 73,000 or 91,000 is difficult to remember and hard to justify if questioned. When people demand a highly specific sum of money under false pretenses, it is almost always because they are staring at a very real invoice. Richard needed exactly $85,000 to cover a specific debt. I thought about my sister standing by the hospital bed. I replayed her phone conversation in my head. She had barked orders at a vendor. She mentioned track lighting. She demanded the delivery of an espresso machine. She stated clearly that the doors were opening on Saturday. I opened a new tab and navigated to the Illinois Secretary of State Business Registry. This is a public database I use every single day in my commercial lease auditing career. I typed Chloe Myers into the registered agent search bar and hit enter. The system took 2 seconds to populate the results. One active business entity appeared. The Golden Bean LLC. The date of formation was exactly 4 months ago. I clicked on the business profile. It listed a primary operating address located in the West Loop. For anyone familiar with Chicago real estate, the West Loop is a premier, hyper-expensive retail district. You do not secure a storefront in that neighborhood without massive upfront capital. I copied the address and logged into the County Recorder of Deeds database. I searched the property records. Within minutes, I found a recently filed memorandum of lease tied to the Golden Bean LLC. The document outlined a commercial rental agreement for a 1,200-square-foot boutique space. My fingers began to tap a slow rhythm against the leather steering wheel. I did not need to open a spreadsheet. When you audit commercial leases for a living, calculating liability becomes a reflex. West Loop retail space, 1,200 square feet. A standard triple net lease requires a 3-month security deposit up front. The number flashed in my mind instantly, $30,000. I thought about my sister screaming into her cell phone in the hospital room. Track lighting, espresso machine. A high-end, commercial-grade espresso machine, like a La Marzocco, runs exactly $12,000. My index finger kept tapping against the leather. 30,000 plus 12,000, 42,000. I pulled the municipal building permits tied to the address on my laptop. Public records showed recent approvals for commercial plumbing upgrades and electrical heavy-ups. I skimmed the filed contractor estimates, $43,000 for the build-out. The tapping stopped. My hands gripped the steering wheel. $30,000 for the deposit, $12,000 for the equipment, $43,000 for the contractors. The math was flawless. $85,000. I leaned back against the leather headrest of my car. The glow from the laptop illuminated the dark cabin. The math was flawless. The narrative was undeniable. My family was not trying to save my mother from a fatal heart condition. They had orchestrated a grotesque theatrical production. They used a routine, minor surgery as a psychological weapon. They wanted to terrorize me, weaponize my guilt, and force me to sign away my half of my grandfather's inheritance. They needed my $85,000 to fund a trendy, high-risk vanity coffee shop for the golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life. The betrayal was so calculated, it made the air in the car feel thin. My father had looked me dead in the eye, handed me a pen, and tried to steal my future while my mother played dead. I closed the laptop. The screen went black. I sat in the quiet dark, letting the reality wash over me. The anger I felt was not hot or explosive. It was cold, sharp, and highly focused. I had the receipts. I knew the truth. But as my professional instinct settled, a new, glaring discrepancy emerged. My father was a seasoned real estate developer. He drove a leased luxury sedan and wore tailored suits. He prided himself on his wealth. If his favorite daughter needed $85,000 to open a cafe, the Richard Myers I knew would have simply written her a check from his personal accounts. He would have funded the project himself just to take the credit at the grand opening. Why was a supposedly wealthy man desperate enough to orchestrate an elaborate, verifiable fraud to steal a restricted trust fund? People only resort to complex theft when their own wells run dry. My father was hiding something much larger than a fake hospital bill. I reached for my phone and dialed the 24-hour automated line for the trust administrator. It was time to find out what was really happening inside Richard's bank accounts. I remained in the driver's seat of my sedan. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:15. The hospital parking garage was empty, wrapped in the quiet dampness of the rainy night. I held my cell phone in my lap. The glow from the screen illuminated the steering wheel. I had the receipts for my mother's fake medical billing. I had the commercial lease documents for my sister's new business venture. But a glaring question remained. Why would a man who spent his entire life projecting immense wealth resort to a verifiable, easily traceable fraud? My grandfather was a meticulous man. When he established the inheritance trust, he did not place his money in a standard retail bank branch. He utilized a boutique wealth management firm based in downtown Chicago. They catered to specific accounts and maintained a 24-hour priority service line for primary beneficiaries. I tapped the saved number in my contacts and put the phone to my ear. A representative named Marcus answered after 2 rings. His voice was crisp and professional. I provided my social security number, my mother's maiden name, and the specific routing digits assigned to the trust account. I heard the faint clacking of a mechanical keyboard through the speaker. I kept my tone steady. I did not sound like a panicked daughter. I sounded like an auditor conducting a routine compliance check. I told Marcus I needed a comprehensive review of all account activity over the past 90 days. I specifically asked if there were any pending liquidation requests or external holds placed on the balance. Marcus paused. The typing stopped. He cleared his throat. He asked if I was calling regarding the commercial collateral hold requested by the secondary lender. I did not hesitate. If you sound like you already know the answer, financial representatives will often fill in the remaining blanks without questioning your authority. I told him I was reviewing the file right now and needed him to verify the exact dates of the collateral request. Marcus explained the mechanism of my father's trap. 3 months ago, Richard walked into a commercial lending office. He applied for a massive small business administration loan. The loan was underwritten specifically for the Golden Bean LLC. My father was listed as the primary financial guarantor for Chloe, but the bank required hard assets to secure the funding. Richard offered my grandfather's $170,000 trust account as the collateral. There was a fatal flaw in his plan. Trust accounts are rigid legal structures. You cannot pledge joint assets without universal consent from all named beneficiaries. The commercial bank flagged the transaction immediately. They issued a conditional approval. This meant the funds were locked in a holding pattern. The bank demanded my physical, notarized signature to execute the final release of the money. Richard had spent 3 months stalling the bank officers. He likely claimed I was traveling abroad or temporarily unreachable. But the grace period was evaporating. The commercial landlord and the construction contractors were demanding their final payments. I thanked Marcus for his time and ended the call. I opened my laptop again. My father was acting as a guarantor for a coffee shop, but he was using my inheritance to do it. That meant his own capital was gone. I accessed the county clerk public database. I ran a search for uniform commercial code filings under my father's name. These filings are public declarations used by creditors to announce their legal interest in a person's personal property. When someone takes on severe debt, a paper trail always appears in the county registry. The screen populated with a cascade of red flags. Richard was drowning in insolvency. Over the past 4 years, he had systematically dismantled his own financial foundation. I found a home equity line of credit recorded against my parents' house, taken out 18 months ago. The document showed the equity was tapped out to the maximum limit. I searched federal tax liens and found a penalty notice indicating he had liquidated his primary retirement accounts early, absorbing the heavy tax hits just to access the raw cash. The reality of my family dynamic snapped into sharp focus. Growing up, my father engineered an illusion of effortless success. He wore custom-tailored suits. He leased German sedans every 2 years. He maintained a pristine golf handicap at a local country club. But the wealth was a hollow facade, built entirely on rotating credit and leveraged debt. Chloe inherited this exact financial philosophy. She equated success with appearance rather than labor. Over the past 5 years, she launched a string of vanity projects. There was an artisanal soap company that never secured a vendor license. There was a luxury travel consultancy that collapsed after she spent the seed money on her own trips to Europe. Each time she failed, Richard quietly bailed her out. He drained his own safety nets to protect her fragile ego and maintain the image of the perfect, thriving family. Now, the well was permanently dry. Richard had bet the last remnants of his net worth on this West Loop cafe. If Chloe failed to open the doors on Saturday, the commercial loan would default before serving a single customer. The contractors would sue for breach of contract. The unpaid home equity line would trigger a foreclosure on the family home. Richard was weeks away from total public bankruptcy. The fake heart surgery was not a random lie. It was a calculated, terminal maneuver. Richard knew I would never agree to fund my sister's failing lifestyle. He knew I had ignored his emails and blocked his calls for 2 years. He needed an event so catastrophic, so time-sensitive, that I would sign the paperwork without reading the fine print. The $85,000 Richard demanded in his living room was the exact cash injection needed to satisfy the vendors, appease the landlord, and unlock the frozen bank funds before the grand opening. I closed my laptop. The screen went black. I sat in the quiet dark, letting the reality wash over me. The anger I felt was not hot or explosive. It was cold, sharp, and highly focused. I had the receipts. I knew the truth. But as my professional instincts settled, a new, glaring discrepancy emerged. My father was a seasoned real estate developer. He drove a leased luxury sedan and wore tailored suits. He prided himself on his wealth. If his favorite daughter needed $85,000 to open a cafe, the Richard Myers I knew would have simply written her a check from his personal accounts. He would have funded the project himself just to take the credit at the grand opening. Why was a supposedly wealthy man desperate enough to orchestrate an elaborate, verifiable fraud to steal a restricted trust fund? People only resort to complex theft when their own wells run dry. My father was hiding something much larger than a fake hospital bill. I reached for my phone and dialed the 24-hour automated line for the trust administrator. It was time to find out what was really happening inside Richard's bank accounts. I went to the hospital. Mom is resting. I will be at the house to sign the papers on Saturday morning. I hit send. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking garage. The trap was set. Friday morning arrived with clear skies. The rain from the previous night had washed the city clean. I sat at my dining room table, drinking a cup of dark roast coffee. My laptop was open. Next to it sat a sleek black leather binder. It was the kind of binder attorneys use during depositions to organize exhibits. My cell phone chimed at 8:15. The notification lit up the screen. It was a text from Chloe. The message was long, punctuated with an excessive number of heart emojis. She wrote about how much she missed our childhood, how grateful she was that I came back, and how our mother was finally resting comfortably because I had agreed to help. She called me her hero. 10 minutes later, a second message arrived. This one was from Richard. His tone was brisk and businesslike, thinly veiling his desperation. He provided a string of routing numbers and an account digit sequence. He instructed me to wire the $85,000 directly to this specific account by noon. He claimed it was a secure medical escrow designed to process the hospital lien immediately. I stared at the routing numbers. My father underestimated my professional capabilities. A routing number is a digital fingerprint. I copied the sequence and pasted it into a banking registry database I use for commercial audits. The results took less than 3 seconds to populate. The account did not belong to St. Jude Hospital. It did not belong to a medical debt collection agency. The routing digits were tied to a commercial property management firm headquartered in the West Loop. It was the exact entity listed as the landlord on the commercial lease for the Golden Bean Cafe. My father was not just lying. He was actively attempting to execute a wire fraud under false pretenses across state lines. He was trying to have me bypass the frozen bank loan and pay his commercial landlord directly using my inheritance. I did not reply to his text. I opened the black leather binder and began organizing my evidence. A successful confrontation requires impeccable formatting. You do not just drop a stack of papers on a table. You present a narrative that cannot be unraveled. In the first clear plastic sleeve, I placed the explanation of benefits from the insurance portal. I used my yellow highlighter to mark the procedure description, routine laparoscopic gallbladder removal. I highlighted the final patient responsibility amount, $450. In the second sleeve, I inserted the Illinois Secretary of State Business Registry printout for the Golden Bean LLC, clearly showing Chloe Myers as the registered agent. In the third sleeve, I added the memorandum of lease and the municipal building permits I had pulled the night before. I highlighted the combined required capital, exactly $85,000. Finally, in the fourth sleeve, I placed a printed transcript of my conversation with Marcus, the trust administrator. The document outlined the frozen commercial loan and the illegal attempt to use the joint inheritance trust as collateral without my signature. I closed the binder. The satisfying click of the metal rings echoed in the quiet apartment. David walked into the dining room. He was wearing his work clothes, a gray button-down shirt and slacks. He looked at the black binder on the table, then looked at my face. He knew my expression. It was the look I got when I uncovered a massive liability during an audit. I told him everything. I explained the fake heart surgery. I detailed the failing coffee shop. I laid out the impending bankruptcy and the illegal attempt to leverage my grandfather's money. David listened in silence. He did not act shocked. After witnessing my father boycott our wedding over a seating chart, David understood that Richard viewed family members as assets rather than people. David asked me what my plan was. He asked if I was going to call the police. I shook my head. I explained that calling the police now would simply result in my father denying everything. Richard would claim he was confused by the hospital billing. He would say he gave me the wrong routing number by mistake. Liars thrive in private conversations where they can manipulate the narrative. To destroy a lie this massive, you must detonate it in public, in front of the very people the liar is trying to impress. I told David I was driving back to the suburbs. I was going to attend the grand opening of my sister's cafe tomorrow morning. David nodded. He kissed the top of my head, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the door. He did not offer to come with me. He knew I had to execute this alone. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, my phone started to ring. It was Richard. He was calling to check the status of the wire transfer. I let it go to voicemail. 20 minutes later, Chloe called. I let it go to voicemail. At 4:30, Richard texted again. The message was frantic. He demanded to know if the funds had cleared. He said the hospital billing department was threatening to finalize the lien by 5 o'clock. The lie was unraveling under the pressure of the commercial landlord's deadline. They needed the money to unlock the doors for tomorrow's opening. Without the wire transfer, the cafe was dead in the water. I finally replied. I tacked a single ambiguous sentence. There was a delay with the bank transfer limit. I will bring the physical authorization papers in person tomorrow morning. I hit send and immediately turned my phone off completely. I placed the device face down on the dining room table. The silence in the apartment was deafening. I imagined the panic erupting in my parents' house. I pictured Richard pacing the living room, sweating through his tailored sweater. I pictured Chloe screaming about her espresso machine. I pictured my mother, miraculously recovered from her fake bypass, wringing her hands. They had spent 2 years ignoring my existence. They had written me off as collateral damage in their pursuit of status. Now, their entire financial survival depended on my arrival.
They had laid a trap, assuming I was a desperate grieving daughter. They had no idea they had invited a forensic auditor to their grand opening. I packed a small overnight bag. I chose my clothing carefully. I did not want to look like a victim. I selected a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white blouse, and black leather heels. It was my armor. I placed the black binder into my briefcase. The trap was officially set. The evidence was secured. The only thing left to do was show up. The West Loop neighborhood on a Saturday morning operates on a specific frequency. It is a district built on high-end retail, expensive lofts, and curated aesthetics. I drove down the cobblestone street and parallel parked my sedan directly across from the address listed on the commercial lease. The weather was crisp and bright. I turned off the engine, left the keys in the ignition, and looked through my passenger side window. The storefront of my sister's new business sat on the corner of the block. The sign above the door read, "The Golden Bean," in thick brushed brass lettering. A massive arch of metallic balloons framed the entryway. The exterior walls were painted a matte charcoal, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a pristine, unobstructed view into the heart of the cafe. From my vantage point inside the quiet car, I had a front-row seat to the illusion my family had constructed. The interior was packed. The room buzzed with local social media influencers holding their phones high, recording the aesthetic lighting and the expensive decor. Behind the sweeping marble counter stood Chloe. She was wearing a pristine white linen apron over a designer silk shirt. Her hair was professionally styled. She was leaning against the crown jewel of the operation, a gleaming $12,000 commercial espresso machine. She was laughing, tossing her hair over her shoulder, and posing for photographs. She looked like the ultimate successful entrepreneur. She did not look like a woman who was technically operating a business on stolen time and forged capital. I shifted my gaze away from my sister and scanned the crowd near the pastry displays. I found my father. Richard was holding court in the center of the room. He wore a navy blue blazer tailored to fit his shoulders perfectly. He held a ceramic coffee cup in one hand and used the other to gesture broadly as he spoke. He was smiling, projecting the image of the wealthy patriarch funding his daughter's brilliant startup. I looked at the men standing in a circle around him. I recognized their faces instantly. They were the commercial real estate developers my father spent his entire career trying to impress. I recognized Harrison. I recognized Grant. I recognized Mitchell. These were the exact men Richard had written onto my wedding seating chart 2 years ago. These were the men he demanded I invite at the expense of my own friends. These were the men he chose over walking his own daughter down the aisle. Seeing them standing there, sipping coffee funded by a fraudulent loan, cemented the reality of the situation. My father had sacrificed my wedding to maintain his image in front of these men, and now he was trying to sacrifice my inheritance to do it again. Then I saw my mother. Susan Myers walked out from the back kitchen area. She was wearing a fitted floral dress and wedges. She was carrying a heavy wooden tray loaded with assorted pastries. She navigated through the dense crowd, laughing and offering napkins to the guests. I stared at her chest. I stared at her posture. According to the narrative Richard sold me in his living room, this woman had undergone a quadruple bypass 48 hours ago. She was supposed to be in a specialized cardiac recovery unit. Her sternum was supposed to be wired shut. Yet here she was, carrying a wooden tray and hosting a party. The sheer audacity of their lie was staggering. They did not even bother to keep her hidden at home. They were so confident in their manipulation, so sure that I would wire the money blindly out of fear, that they put the supposed cardiac patient to work on opening day. I looked away from the window and picked up my cell phone from the cup holder. The screen was dark. I pressed the side button. A flood of notifications stacked upon the lock screen. I had 14 missed calls. 12 were from Richard, 2 were from Chloe. I unlocked the device and opened my text messages. I scrolled to the top of the thread and read my father's messages chronologically. They mapped the precise trajectory of a man whose house of cards was collapsing in real time. At 8 in the morning, his tone was casual. He wrote, "Good morning, sweetie. Just checking the status of the bank confirmation."
At 9, the tone shifted. He wrote, "Did you go to the bank yet? Please call me immediately." By 9:30, the panic set in. He wrote, "Tessa, pick up the phone. The hospital administrator is threatening to file the lien today." At 9:45, the facade cracked. He wrote, "Tessa, this is not a game. The landlord just called. If the wire does not hit the escrow account by noon, he is bringing a padlock and shutting the power off." At 10:15, his final message was a single sentence. "Where are you? We are going to lose everything." I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. It was 10:30 in the morning. I understood exactly what was happening behind the scenes. In commercial real estate, landlords often grant a brief cure period for bounced checks. Richard had likely written a bad check for the security deposit earlier in the week. He promised the property management firm that a wire transfer would clear by Saturday morning to cure the default. The landlord allowed them to open the doors for the grand opening, but they were monitoring the escrow account. If my $85,000 did not land in their system by midday, the landlord would execute a legal lockout. My father was standing in a room full of his wealthy peers, smiling and shaking hands, while his phone vibrated in his pocket with the threat of total public ruin. He was trapped in a prison of his own design. I turned off the screen and placed the phone inside my leather briefcase. I looked down at my clothes. I had dressed with intention. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white blouse, and black leather heels. I did not look like a grieving daughter. I did not look like a supportive sister. I looked exactly like what I was, a commercial auditor arriving to conduct a hostile site inspection. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the black leather binder. It held the insurance explanation of benefits. It held the state business registry. It held the commercial lease terms. It held the transcript from the trust administrator detailing the bank fraud. The binder had a satisfying weight in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of the truth. I stepped out of the sedan and locked the door behind me. The morning air hit my face. The sounds of the city surrounded me, the rumble of passing delivery trucks, the chatter of pedestrians. I waited for a break in the traffic and crossed the cobblestone street. I did not feel nervous. I did not feel the erratic, messy heat of anger. Anger makes you raise your voice. Anger makes you lose your leverage. I felt nothing but cold, procedural clarity. I was not walking into that cafe to make a scene. I was not going to scream or cry or ask them how they could betray me. I was walking into that room to execute a financial demolition. I stepped onto the sidewalk. I walked under the balloon arch. I reached out, grasped the heavy brass handle of the glass door, and pulled it open. The heavy brass handle yielded to my pull, and the glass door swung open. A small bell chimed above my head, a cheerful sound that cut through the low hum of conversation inside. The air conditioning hit my face, carrying the scent of roasted coffee beans, fresh paint, and vanilla syrup. I stepped over the threshold and let the door close behind me. For the first 3 seconds, nobody noticed my arrival. The room was consumed by the manufactured energy of a launch party. The local influencers continued taking photographs of their latte art. The investors continued discussing commercial zoning laws. Then Chloe looked up from the espresso machine. She was mid-laugh, posing for a photo with a local food blogger. When her eyes locked onto me standing near the entrance, her mouth snapped shut. The smile vanished from her face so quickly it looked painful. She lowered her arms and took a step back, bumping into the stainless steel counter. Her sudden movement caught my mother's attention. Susan turned around. She was carrying a large wooden tray stacked high with almond croissants and heavy ceramic mugs. When she saw me, she stopped walking. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her face a pale, chalky white. Her hands began to tremble, causing the ceramic mugs to rattle against the wood. This was the woman who was supposed to be trapped in an intensive care bed with a wired sternum. She stood frozen in her floral dress, carrying 20 pounds of servingware. Richard noticed the sudden silence radiating from the counter. He followed his wife's gaze and spotted me standing near the front window. His reaction was immediate. He excused himself from the circle of real estate investors. He forced a wide, tight smile onto his face and walked rapidly across the room toward me. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man trying to contain a localized fire. He reached me and immediately stepped into my personal space. He reached out to grab my elbow, attempting to steer me toward a closed door at the back of the cafe labeled Private Office. His voice was a frantic, hushed hiss. He asked what I was doing dressed like this. He demanded to know if I had initiated the wire transfer to the medical escrow account. He told me the landlord was calling his cell phone every 10 minutes and we needed to go into the back room to finalize the paperwork right now. I did not move. I planted my feet firmly on the polished concrete floor. When he tried to pull my arm, I pulled it back with a sharp, deliberate motion. I did not whisper. I did not lower my voice to protect his reputation. I spoke in the clear, carrying tone I use when presenting audit findings to a corporate board. I told him we were not going to the back office. I said we were going to handle our family business right here, in the open, in front of the people he valued so highly. The volume of my voice acted like a switch. The ambient chatter in the cafe died away. The music playing through the overhead speakers suddenly felt entirely too loud. Heads turned in our direction. The real estate investors stopped talking. My Uncle Robert, my father's older brother who had flown in from Denver for the opening, stepped forward from the pastry line. I turned my attention away from my father and looked directly at my mother. She was still holding the wooden tray, her knuckles white from the strain. I projected my voice across the room and asked her a simple question. I asked her how the laparoscopic gallbladder removal went. I asked if she was experiencing any residual nausea from the light anesthesia, and if the $450 copay had cleared her insurance deductible yet. A collective gasp rippled through the extended family members standing nearby. My mother realized she was trapped. Her social survival instincts kicked in. In a desperate bid to save face, she tried to resurrect the dying patient routine. She let out a weak, theatrical gasp and pressed one hand against her collarbone, attempting a delicate swoon. But it is incredibly difficult to stage a graceful cardiac event while balancing a 20-pound tray of baked goods. As she forced her knees to buckle in a fake collapse, the heavy wooden tray tipped forward. It hit the floor with a deafening crash. Ceramic mugs shattered into pieces. Croissants scattered across the concrete. She slumped against a nearby display table, her eyes squeezed shut, performing an unconvincing feint while the entire room stared at her in disgusted disbelief. Uncle Robert stepped carefully around the broken ceramics and approached me. He looked deeply confused. He told me Richard had called the entire family on Thursday night, weeping, claiming Susan needed an $85,000 emergency heart bypass to survive the weekend. I unzipped my black leather briefcase. I pulled out the first clear plastic sleeve containing the Blue Cross explanation of benefits. I handed the official hospital document directly to Uncle Robert. I told him to read the procedure code and the final billing amount. Robert adjusted his reading glasses. He looked at the paper. His jaw tightened. He looked up at Richard, his expression morphing from confusion to sheer disgust. Robert muttered the words gallbladder and $400 under his breath, loud enough for the people around him to hear. Richard stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He raised his hands, trying to laugh it off, attempting to tell the crowd there had been a massive administrative mix-up with the hospital billing department. He tried to claim I was just confused. I did not let him control the narrative. I walked past him and approached the long marble counter where Chloe was cowering behind the espresso machine. I placed my black leather binder onto the marble surface. I flipped it open. I pulled out the commercial lease agreement and laid it flat on the counter. Next to it, I placed the municipal building permits. Finally, I laid down the transcript detailing the frozen commercial loan. I turned to face the room. I looked directly at Harrison, Grant, and Mitchell, the wealthy investors my father worshipped. I spoke clearly, ensuring every single person understood the math. I pointed to the lease document. I explained that securing this specific retail space required a $30,000 security deposit. I pointed to the building permits and stated that the contractor build-out cost exactly $43,000. I pointed at the espresso machine Chloe was hiding behind and noted its $12,000 retail price. I added the numbers out loud. 30,000, 43,000, 12,000. I told the room the total equaled exactly $85,000. I explained that Richard had drained his own retirement accounts to fund Chloe's previous failures. I explained that he tried to take out a commercial loan to pay for this cafe, but he illegally used a joint inheritance trust belonging to me and my sister as the collateral. I told the investors that because I refused to sign the authorization, the bank froze the loan. I looked back at my father. He looked physically ill. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The wealthy men he had tried to impress were now staring at him like he was a massive legal liability. They recognized bank fraud when they heard it. Grant actually set his coffee cup down and took 2 steps toward the exit. I finished the explanation. I told the room that my father invented a fatal heart condition and used my mother's supposed impending death to terrorize me. He needed me to blindly wire $85,000 of my own inheritance to his commercial landlord by noon today, or the locks on this building would be changed. The silence in the cafe was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody defended him. The illusion of the wealthy, successful family was completely shattered, replaced by the ugly reality of extortion and impending bankruptcy. The cafe was perfectly still. The ambient noise of the espresso machine cooling down sounded loud in the heavy silence. Richard stood over the marble counter, his chest heaving. The tailored navy blazer that usually gave him an aura of authority now just looked like a costume he was sweating through. He had lost the room. Harrison and Grant were already inching toward the glass exit doors, wanting no part of this liability. Seeing his audience slip away, Richard abandoned all pretense of being a measured, sophisticated businessman. He leaned over the marble surface, invading my space, his face inches from mine. "You owe me," he snarled, his voice vibrating with a raw, desperate edge. "I put a roof over your head for 18 years. I paid for your clothes. I paid for your food. You owe this family." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the folded trust dissolution form. He slammed it down next to my black binder. He produced a silver pen and shoved it toward my hand. "If you do not sign this paper today, the bank will foreclose on the house," he said, his voice rising in volume until he was almost shouting. "Do you understand that? They will take my home. They will lock the doors on this cafe. We will have nothing. Stop acting like a spoiled child. Pick up the pen and sign the paper." He was breathing hard, waiting for me to flinch. Growing up, this was the exact tone he used to end arguments. It was a verbal steamroller designed to crush opposition. He expected me to revert to the obedient teenager who handed over her paycheck to help cover his credit card bills. I did not touch the silver pen. I did not look at the trust document. I looked him dead in the eyes. I felt no fear, no guilt, no obligation. The emotional leverage he held over me died 2 years ago in a hotel lobby. I kept my hands at my sides. My voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. "I called the FBI," I said. 4 words. They hung in the air, cold and definitive. Richard stopped breathing. The silver pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the marble counter. Behind him, Chloe let out a sharp, pathetic gasp and grabbed the edge of the espresso machine. I did not break eye contact with my father. I did not waste time explaining the complex mechanics of his destruction. I simply dropped the exact keywords that men like Harrison and Grant spend their entire careers avoiding. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my binder and laid it over his trust document. It was a copy of the initial commercial loan application. Forging my initials on a federally backed SBA loan application is not a family dispute, I said, projecting my voice so it echoed across the quiet cafe. It is severe, prosecutable federal bank fraud. The effect was immediate. The wealthy men Richard spent years trying to impress suddenly looked at him like he was radioactive. Grant actually set his coffee cup down on a nearby table and took 3 rapid steps toward the exit doors. Men who build their empires on calculated risk know exactly when to cut their losses. I picked up the silver pen he had thrown at me. I rolled it between my fingers. At 8 o'clock this morning, I forwarded this forged application to the bank's internal fraud department. I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. I also sent your illegally liquidated retirement records to the Internal Revenue Service. I figured the federal authorities would want a comprehensive look at your sudden insolvency. Richard took a shaky step backward. His lips were pale. He bumped into a display rack of roasted coffee beans, sending several bags tumbling to the floor. He realized this was not a family argument he could win by yelling. It was a legal execution. I delivered the final blow. The bank permanently froze the holding account at 9 o'clock this morning, I said. The loan is canceled. Your Social Security number is flagged in the National Registry. You will never secure a commercial line of credit again. The money is gone. I zipped my leather briefcase closed. The sound of the metal teeth locking into place was the only noise in the room. I did not wait for a response from the man standing frozen behind the marble counter. There was nothing left to say. I turned my back on my father, my mother, and my sister. I walked toward the front entrance, pushed the glass door open, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The small bell chimed a cheerful farewell, a sharp contrast to the financial devastation I left in my wake. I did not drive back to Chicago immediately. I walked half a block down the street, purchased a black coffee from an established competitor, and sat on a public wrought iron bench. I wanted to witness the structural collapse of their illusion. It did not take long for the dominoes to fall. The real estate investors exited first. Harrison, Grant, and Mitchell did not linger to offer condolences or advice. They practically jogged to their parked luxury vehicles. Men who build their careers on calculated risk know exactly when to cut their losses, and they were eager to distance their own portfolios from a man actively facing federal bank fraud allegations. The social media influencers followed shortly after, sensing the toxic shift in the atmosphere. They lowered their camera phones, stopped recording their aesthetic content, and scattered down the block. By noon, the inevitable consequence arrived. A white maintenance truck belonging to the commercial property management firm pulled up to the curb. Two men in dark work uniforms stepped out carrying a heavy steel chain and a thick brass padlock. The grace period for the bounce security deposit had officially expired. I watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as the maintenance men spoke to Richard. My father looks hollowed out, stripped of his arrogance. He did not argue. He did not yell. He simply gathered his tailored coat and nodded. They were escorted out onto the sidewalk. The maintenance workers looped the thick steel chain through the brass handles of the front doors and snapped the padlock shut. The $12,000 espresso machine, the custom track lighting, the imported marble counter, all of it was locked inside, legally seized by the landlord to cover the breached contract. Chloe lost her composure entirely. The poised, confident entrepreneur vanished in an instant. She stood in the middle of the crowded West Loop pedestrian path and threw a spectacular, unhinged tantrum. She screamed at our father, her voice echoing off the brick buildings, blaming him for ruining her life. She ripped off her white linen apron and threw it into a dirty puddle on the pavement. She stomped her expensive designer shoes, demanding he call the bank and fix it. But Richard just stared at the concrete, his shoulders slumped. He possessed no more magic tricks, no more hidden funds, and no more leverage to pacify her. The events of that Saturday morning triggered a rapid, systematic cascade of financial ruin. Federal investigations move at their own pace, but banking panic happens instantly. When a federal entity like the Small Business Administration flags an applicant for loan fraud, the alert echoes across the entire national banking registry. Within 2 weeks, Richard's primary commercial bank called in his outstanding debts. The home equity line of credit he had secretly maxed out went into immediate default. The Internal Revenue Service finalized their penalty assessments regarding his illegally liquidated retirement accounts, demanding immediate payment. To avoid federal prison and settle the massive government tax liens, Richard was forced into a corner with no exits. He had to liquidate his only remaining tangible asset. 30 days after the cafe failed, a wooden foreclosure notice was hammered into the front lawn of my childhood home. The property was sold at a public auction for a fraction of its market value. Richard and Susan were forced to pack their belongings into rented moving trucks under the watchful, judging eyes of their suburban neighbors. They moved into a cramped, outdated two-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. Because she possessed no income, no savings, and no credit history of her own to secure a lease. The financial devastation was severe, but the social annihilation was what truly broke my mother. Susan had spent her entire adult life cultivating an image of suburban perfection. She thrived on the approval of her charity boards and her neighborhood associations. Her currency was community status. But Uncle Robert had flown back to Denver with the printed hospital bill safely tucked in his pocket. He did not keep the secret. He told the extended family about the fake quadruple bypass. He told them how Susan stood in a coffee shop carrying a heavy wooden tray of pastries while pretending her sternum was wired together. The gossip spread like wildfire through their social circles. The women she ran local charity races with stopped returning her phone calls. Her weekend book club quietly revoked her membership via a polite email. When she walked down the aisles of the local grocery store, people turned their shopping carts around and walked down different aisles to avoid making eye contact. She became a pariah, isolated by the sheer grotesqueness of her own manipulation. I drove back to Chicago that Saturday afternoon in silence. The rain had cleared out, leaving the highway bright and dry. The hum of the tires against the asphalt felt like a physical release of tension. When I walked into my apartment, David was sitting on the couch reading a hardcover book. He looked up, saw the calm expression on my face, and smiled. He did not ask how it went. He walked over, took my coat, kissed my forehead, and put the kettle on the stove. We spent the evening mapping out our upcoming vacation, surrounded by peace. On Monday morning, I finalized my defensive perimeter. I placed a permanent, hard security freeze on my Social Security number across all 3 major credit bureaus, ensuring my father could never attempt to open another line of credit or forge a loan application in my name again. I formally contacted the wealth management firm. With the fraudulent commercial loan permanently canceled, the trust administrator legally dissolved the joint account. My half of my grandfather's money, exactly $85,000, was wired directly into a secure, private investment portfolio that only I controlled. People often tell you that family is paramount. Society conditions us to believe that sharing genetic material creates an unbreakable contract of loyalty. We are told to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek, to forgive endless, painful transgressions because blood is thicker than water. But holding on to a toxic relationship is like holding on to a drowning person who refuses to learn how to swim. Eventually, they will panic, pull you under the surface, and drown you, just to keep themselves afloat for a few more seconds. Walking away from my parents and my sister was not an act of malice. It was not a punishment designed to make them suffer. It was a necessary rescue mission for my own future. I did not burn the bridge to my childhood home. I simply recognized that the bridge was built on lies, extortion, and theft, and I refused to pay the devastating toll required to cross it anymore. My life now is quiet, predictable, and profoundly safe. If you are listening to this and you have ever been made to feel like the villain for protecting yourself, I want you to know you aren't crazy. You don't owe your future to someone else's mistakes. What is the most insane lie someone has told to get money from you? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story. It has been 14 months since the heavy steel padlock snapped shut on the glass doors of my sister's cafe. I am sitting in my home office in Chicago. The morning sun warms the surface of my oak desk. I have a ceramic mug of black coffee resting next to my open laptop. My phone sits silently on the corner of the table. There are no frantic voicemails waiting for me. There are no manufactured medical emergencies demanding my immediate presence. The quiet in my house is not a void. It is a secure fortress I built with my own hands. When people hear the story of that Saturday morning, they often ask me the same question. They ask how I managed to zip up my leather briefcase and walk out without feeling a crushing sense of guilt. The truth is, guilt requires the belief that you committed a wrong. I did not harm my family. I simply stopped offering myself as the collateral damage for their reckless choices. Through the painful auditing of my own family tree, I learned 2 strict rules that keep my life entirely secure. First, biology is not a binding financial contract. Sharing a last name does not give anyone a rightful claim to your bank account or the future you worked hard to build. The numbers on a balance sheet do not weep, and they never lie. Audit the tiers, secure your assets, and never let guilt fund someone else's manipulation. Second, walking away is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Society demands we keep repairing bridges that the other side is actively burning. Dropping the tools and walking away is not a failure. It is the only way to build a stable roof over your own head. My grandfather understood the difference between the illusion of wealth and the tangible value of hard work. He left me a safety net. I honored his memory by making sure it caught me, rather than letting it fund a felony. If my story resonated with you, you have found the right community. Welcome to Sweet Karma Life. We focus on the truth that remains after the smoke clears. Does walking away make you the villain, or does it make you the survivor? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below. I read them every single day. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Protect your peace, secure your future, and I will see you in the next story.